Today we're going to be talking all about cardiac pressure volume loops, which looks at the changing relationship between left ventricular pressure on the y-axis and the left ventricular volume on the x-axis. Now, one loop around this graph represents one cardiac cycle or one heartbeat, or one phase of ventricular systole and diastole. So the pressure volume loop actually starts in the lower right-hand corner, called the end diastolic point. And this is the point in the cardiac cycle when diastole actually ends. It's at this point where actually the mitral valve has just closed and causes that lub sound or the S1 sound. At this point, the left ventricle is filled with the max volume of blood, and sometimes we call this the end diastolic volume. Usually, this is around 120 milliliters. At this point, the ventricle is actually pretty relaxed, so the pressure remains pretty low. This is the beginning of systole, where the left ventricle starts to contract, but because the AV valve and the mitral valve are closed, the volume doesn't change at all, it's just the pressure. Once the pressure reaches about 75 millimeters of mercury, the pressure is then just a little higher than the aorta, and it forces the aortic valve to open. This phase right here is actually called the isovolumetric contraction, and it's actually pretty short, lasting just about 0.05 seconds. This is now the ejection phase. Now, blood from the left ventricle is going into the aorta, so it's decreasing in volume, but because it continues to contract, the pressure keeps increasing. This is called the ejection phase, and it lasts about 0.25 seconds. It reaches a peak pressure of around 120 millimeters of mercury. And this is what we consider our systolic pressure, whereas this is usually our diastolic pressure. Now, eventually the aortic pressure becomes higher than the left ventricular pressure, and this forces the AV valve to close. That causes that dub sound or that S2 heart sound. So now we're at the end of systole, so this would be our end systolic point. And the volume at this point is usually around 50 milliliters. We can also call this point the end systolic volume, whereas this is the end diastolic volume. If we take the end diastolic volume and we minus the end systolic volume, we actually get the stroke volume. So if we look at end diastolic volume, which is 120 mLs, minus 50 mLs, it gives us a stroke volume of 70 mLs. At this point now, the AV valve has closed and the ventricle starts to relax, so it actually decreases in pressure. We call this portion the isovolumetric relaxation phase, and this lasts about 0.15 seconds. So at this point, the left ventricular pressure has dropped below the pressure of the atria, and that allows the mitral valve to open. So blood then, the volume goes back up to the end diastolic volume right here, because the blood is starting to fill into the left ventricle again, because there's a pressure gradient between the atria and the ventricle. Now, for the first portion, it's going to happen pretty passively, but on the last portion, you're going to get that atrial contraction, or that atrial kick, that gives it a little bit of a bump in pressure. Now, once the pressure between the atria and the ventricle starts to equilibrate, the mitral valve will then close and the cycle repeats itself all over again. A couple more values for you to know. If you want to know the pulse pressure, it's actually the difference between the systolic blood pressure and the diastolic blood pressure. So that's going to be 120 millimeters of mercury minus 75 millimeters of mercury, and that's going to give you a pulse pressure of 45. If you want to know the ejection fraction, you're actually going to take your stroke volume and divide it by your end diastolic volume. So if we have a stroke volume of 70, and we divided that by 120 mLs, that's going to give you an EF of about 58%. With every heartbeat, the heart is doing work, and we call this stroke work. And the stroke work is actually proportional to the area inside this loop. So if you see a bigger area, you see more stroke work. The cardiac pressure volume loop is going to give you a ton of information about the systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, and diastolic volume, and systolic volume, and other values here like our stroke volume, our pulse pressure, and our EF.